we resolved that the aim of our policy would be to keep our people out of the war.
The hour of our greatest effort and action is approaching. We march with valiant allies who count on us as we count on them.
When Adolf Hitler's forces seized control of Europe during the Second World War, the Taoiseach Eamon De Valera and his British counterpart Winston Churchill prepared for their own bitter and personal battle.
Churchill hated neutrals. He regarded neutrals as feeble at best and as despicably cowardly at worst. I mean, he couldn't bear it. One of the chief hate figures for Churchill during the Second World War was De Valera, as he's taken to calling him.
De Valera and Churchill were to clash repeatedly over the partition of Ireland and the South's refusal to join the fight against Nazi Germany. Never before had the history and destinies of Britain and Ireland come down so starkly to the tension between two very different but equally determined politicians.
You've two men here who, in their personalities, encapsulate their countries. Churchill, he is very much seen as Britain, although probably England would be a lot closer to it. And De Valera is very much personifying Ireland and sees himself as personifying Ireland. So that the animosity between the two men really, I suppose, encapsulates that animosity between the two countries.
At 2 a.m. on the 8th of December 1941, just hours after Japan bombed the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, the ferocious feud between Churchill and De Valera was to intensify dramatically. And what happened was to influence the relationship between Britain and Ireland for generations to come.
Churchill was clearly euphoric. The thing he was most wished had happened. America was in the war, and he sent a telegram which read along the lines of, "It's now or never, a nation once again." It clearly offered a united Ireland, but De Valera chose not to see it like that.
When he was offered what seemed to be the big prize, he decided to support a partitionist Ireland, because that's what neutrality meant.
It's one of the great what-ifs of history.
From the very moment he was born, Winston Churchill was a privileged member of the English aristocracy and of a family that believed fervently in defending the British Empire.
Don't forget that Churchill was the son of his father, and his father had said, Lord Randolph Churchill had said most famously, the most famous thing he ever said, "Ulster will fight and Ulster will be right." So he believed in the unity of the empire under the crown, and he wanted to preserve that as much as he possibly could.
Born in New York to an Irish immigrant mother and a Spanish-Cuban settler, the young Eamon De Valera had little in common with Winston Churchill. But like the young Englishman, his political star was in the ascendancy following the 1916 Easter Rising.
What's often forgotten, I suppose, is that De Valera was at the head of a movement that incorporated a lot of very disparate elements. There were moderates in the Sinn Féin movement, there were extremists in the Sinn Féin movement, people who would have been referred to as diehards. De Valera fell very much in the middle ground.
With De Valera a driving force within the Republican movement and Churchill installed as Secretary of State for War in the British cabinet, the seeds of a hostile relationship between the two men were being sown as Ireland lurched towards the War of Independence.
I think of all the British politicians, Churchill would have been the one viewed with deepest suspicion. Churchill defended the use of counter-terror in Ireland, and that's not very attractive to people who are on the other end of the counter-terror. So I think from the De Valera perspective and the Irish political elite perspective, Churchill would have been seen negatively.
Although he had gained a reputation as a hardliner during the War of Independence, by 1921, Churchill was playing an unlikely role within the British cabinet.
When the situation got to its worst peak of violence, he said, we have to start negotiations. And it was Churchill who went to see Lloyd George and wrote to Lloyd George and begged Lloyd George to begin negotiations. He said, our slogan should be simple: quit murdering and start arguing.
As the talks between Sinn Féin and the British government began in London, De Valera chose to stay behind in Dublin. But those who did attend, including Michael Collins and Arthur Griffith, found Churchill to be adamant that Britain retain sovereignty over 3 deep-water ports on the west coast of Ireland. In Churchill's view, these so-called treaty ports of Bearhaven, Queenstown and Lough Swilly were key to Britain's strategic interests in the Atlantic.
Churchill believed that it was important to retain a foothold in the Irish Free State as it was then. I think one can say that the treaty ports were a kind of glue that stuck the crown to the harp.
Churchill played an important role in persuading Collins of the importance of the treaty ports to Britain. Churchill took Collins to his office and laid out the case. Collins then, according to Churchill, said, of course you must have the ports. I see that they are fundamental for your life, the life of Britain.
The compromises conceded by Collins and the other Irish delegates were rejected by De Valera and led to a bloody split within the Republican movement. Now De Valera's attempts to destroy the treaty were viewed with alarm and contempt by one of its chief architects.
Churchill believed passionately in the treaty, and the response of the hardliners, the De Valera faction who were going to resist it and who were fighting in the Civil War, was absolutely anathema to him. He saw this as fanaticism, and somebody who believed what De Valera believed was a fanatic. He must be a fanatic.
Churchill presented De Valera as being somebody who had been faithless to the provisional government, his own former comrades, and somebody who was not even pretending to control the extremists on his own side.
Although the anti-treaty forces were to lose the Civil War, De Valera came to power 10 years later as leader of a new political party. A party that rejected the terms of the treaty and promised a united and fully independent Ireland.
The programme of Fianna Fáil has now been definitely adopted as the national policy of the Irish people. Ireland united, Ireland free, Ireland self-supporting and self-reliant, Ireland speaking her own tongue and through it giving to the world her ancient treasures of Christian Gaelic culture. These are the ideals to which enthusiastic young Ireland is now devoting its energies.
In pursuit of this vision of Ireland, De Valera set about dismantling the terms of the 1921 treaty, and through the Anglo-Irish Free Trade Agreement with Neville Chamberlain's British government, regained possession of the Atlantic ports in 1938.
Chamberlain, as part of his general appeasement policy throughout the world, he gave back the treaty ports. Now he understood that, say, the event of a world war or some such contingency, that the British would get the use of them again. But that was never De Valera's understanding or his intention. He had been steering towards a course in neutrality. He was a superb strategist. Now the one man who realised what he was doing in English politics apparently was Churchill. Churchill saw his beloved ports going. He regarded them, as he described them, as the sentinel posts guarding the western approaches.
One of Churchill's most important speeches in May 1938, when the abandonment of the treaty ports took place, was to explain point by point, technically, why this would be disastrous, because A, Churchill believed, rightly, that war would come, and B, that the war would be fought at sea, Britain's lifeline, vital lifeline, would be at sea, and that the loss of the treaty ports would be disastrous.
Spike Island and the adjoining Cork Harbour defences have been handed over to the custody of Ireland. This is the first stage in pursuance of the defence provisions of the agreement between the British government and Mr. De Valera.
Chamberlain's agreement with De Valera was all part and parcel of appeasement. You know, he was appeasing Hitler, he was appeasing India, he was appeasing De Valera. And Churchill believed in, you know, that the lion should be strong and should occasionally roar, whereas Neville Chamberlain was just a pussycat.
For over 3 years, Hitler had been building a massive military machine. And the threat of war in Europe was increasing dramatically. Now, Churchill, who had been in the political wilderness for much of the 1930s and was a fierce critic of Chamberlain's attempts to appease Hitler, was on the verge of a political comeback.
By the summer of 1939, there were widespread calls for Churchill to return to the cabinet. There certainly had been a big public relations campaign in the press saying we must have Churchill, and it was really inevitable that Chamberlain would have to bow to that pressure.
It is startling and fearful to realize that we are no longer safe in our island home. For nearly 1,000 years, England has never seen the campfires of an invader.
Churchill was the bulldog spirit, as it were, and was recognised as such, and he came in determined to make his mark after 10 years in the wilderness on the government policy, and in particular on policy towards Ireland.
Having returned to the cabinet as First Lord of the Admiralty, Churchill prepared for war. But De Valera remained adamant that Ireland would plot its own course through the difficult waters ahead.
De Valera had made it clear from about 1936 that he was determined to keep Ireland out of the war. There were a number of reasons for that, not least among which was the fear of a return to civil war. The Civil War was barely 16 years in the past, and De Valera felt, and his Fianna Fáil ministers felt very strongly, that neutrality had to be maintained in order to not give the IRA any reason to kind of resurge during the war.
There's also a degree of self-interest inherent in this decision for Ireland to stay neutral in 1939. Or why wouldn't there have been? If Ireland could avoid the excesses of the Second World War, could avoid the bombardment, the loss of life, that was obviously going to be a calculation as well. So there are a number of different issues that are feeding in to the decision to stay neutral. But the one line that he maintained consistently throughout the war was that Irish neutrality was an inevitable consequence of Irish history and what he calls the forced partition of our national territory.
De Valera's view is that small states suffer in big powers' wars. And in his historical view, the Irish had already suffered enough as a result of Britain's world enterprises, and he wasn't going to have this happen again.
Just 2 weeks after the start of the war, and with Hitler's armies rampaging across Europe, Ireland's strategic importance to the British war effort was becoming clearer day by day. On the 14th of September 1939, Neville Chamberlain sent a leading diplomat, Sir John Loder Maffei, to meet De Valera and persuade him to join the fight against Nazi Germany.
Sir John Loder Maffei was a career diplomat. He brought all that kind of Foreign Office lore and guile to bear on De Valera. But he wasn't long making up his mind that you wouldn't be able to browbeat De Valera, you couldn't threaten him. He thought he was narrow and inflexible, and he did everything within his power to get him into the war.
Maffei, being the good diplomat he was, he made friends with De Valera, he established a good relationship with De Valera, and he tried to bring him in. And De Valera took him to the map. And what did he do? He pointed out that partition existed. He showed him, where Northern Ireland was, where Ulster was. And he said, yes, but let's be all in this together. Partition is a stumbling block here.
We resolved that the aim of our policy would be to keep our people out of the war. With our history and with a part of our country still unjustly severed from us, we felt that no other decision and no other policy was possible.
As a key member of Chamberlain's cabinet, Churchill had little patience for De Valera's position. He was incensed that a nation with such close links to Britain should declare itself neutral in the face of the Nazi threat.
I think the first issue for Churchill was that he never really accepted the legality of Irish independence. He had no sense that Ireland had any right to be neutral. So he actually, at the beginning of the war, he described them as at war but skulking.
Churchill utterly rejected the Irish government's position, but he made it very clear that the moment the Germans effected a lodgment, as it was called, a landing on the Irish coast, then, of course, Britain would send its army and troops based in Northern Ireland, send them through in order to repel the Germans. It wouldn't be an invasion of Southern Ireland, but it would be self-protection.
By now, Hitler's armies appeared unstoppable. And as they turned their attention towards Western Europe, Churchill was about to take center stage in the fight for Britain's survival.
On the 10th of May 1940, Hitler, who had already conquered Poland, Denmark and Norway, invaded Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg and France, and his army swept through. And at that moment, the British public had had enough of a conservative administration. So there was a call for a coalition government, a national government, and Churchill was called upon to head it. So he became Prime Minister on the 10th of May in the early afternoon of an all-party coalition government.
He felt at that time as though he was walking with destiny and that his whole life had been but a preparation for this time of trial.
I speak to you for the first time as Prime Minister in a solemn hour for the life of our country, of our empire, of our allies, and above all, of the cause of freedom.
Churchill becomes Prime Minister. The war in Europe is going badly and continues to go badly in May and June. By June 1940, Britain is alone. It was clear that the German forces were at the Channel, so Britain is exposed.
With over 700 Allied ships sunk in the Atlantic during the first 6 months of 1940, access to the treaty ports in Ireland was a growing priority for Churchill. And fearing that Hitler's troops might invade Ireland to prepare an attack on Britain, the newly installed British Prime Minister saw Irish neutrality as a threat to his nation's survival.
Britain feared an invasion from Germany. The fear in Ireland was that there could be a simultaneous invasion of Ireland as a kind of backdoor into Britain. But the Irish had kind of double the worry, because there was also a simultaneous fear of a British invasion in order to forestall a German invasion.
There were genuine fears that Ireland was going to be invaded, either by Germany, most obviously after the fall of France. There was also a fear expressed at one stage that Britain would use the fall of France to compel Ireland to come into the Second World War effectively by invading it itself. And there was a belief in certain quarters that Britain would, in fact, attempt to reconquer Ireland.
But instead of invading Ireland, in June 1940, Churchill decided to go down the path of diplomacy. And the man charged with travelling to Dublin and persuading De Valera to enter the war was Malcolm MacDonald. As a member of the British negotiating team that had returned the treaty ports to Ireland in 1938, MacDonald was already well known to De Valera.
Malcolm MacDonald, by the time of the war, is operating in a much different context. He's then Minister for Health. But he is seen as somebody who could be a very effective conduit to De Valera because of their personal relationship between them, and perhaps because he had more of an insight into how De Valera's mind worked. And it was often very difficult to figure out how Eamon De Valera's mind worked. So Malcolm MacDonald would have been an advantage from Churchill's perspective in that regard.
The British, in the main, what they wanted was the geostrategic unity of the two islands. They basically wanted Ireland to be part of some type of defence structure, which meant, I think, largely that they would be able to place naval units in the various ports.
Throughout their meetings, De Valera firmly rejected MacDonald's requests for Britain's use of the Irish ports. But MacDonald was to return to Dublin one more time, armed with a dramatic proposal from Churchill, one that offered an end to Irish partition, but which was laced with complications for De Valera.
That was a very serious offer, and it was something that Eamon De Valera had to take very seriously. This was upping the ante, and it was quite clear from the British perspective that it was a serious offer.
But despite the prospect of a united Ireland, the very thing he had craved for 20 years, De Valera declared that he was rejecting Churchill's offer, with regret.
Probably to the forefront of his own thinking would be the immediate now, the potential slaughter this would have brought on the Irish people. If you think of the towns, the open small towns of Ireland at the time, Dublin at the time, they could have been expunged. Churchill referred to the Irish ignoble fear of bombing, but it didn't seem ignoble to the Irish at the time.
For De Valera, it was not only the prospect of German bombers exacting terrible revenge on Ireland that prevented him accepting the proposal. The fact that an end to partition was only on offer in principle also provoked strong reservations.
In principle is one of those classic civil service phrases that means never, and he's not going to be fooled. He realises this. There's a degree of bluster in this, of bluff. How are you going to end partition? How are you going to force the government of Northern Ireland to give up the six-county area? Now, there was an indication that Brookborough might have been prepared to do this. He said once that he was, but I think it's very unlikely that the government of Northern Ireland would agree to what was being proposed.
The British kept dangling partition before them, or the solution of partition, particularly when the offer was made through MacDonald. And he didn't bite for a number of reasons. I think he recognised that the Irish people didn't want to be involved in this war. It was very much a policy of the people. But also, he felt that every time they offered to deal with our partition, that at no stage had they consulted with the Northern Ireland authorities. And there's an interesting description he gave about a game they used to play when they were youngsters, and that was, if you were giving a treat to somebody, you had to have an equal grip on their treat before you did the handover. And he felt in his analogy that they were offering the partition issue, but they weren't really offering it in a way that they could deliver. So there was a great reluctance and suspicion on his part that they were being offered half a bargain in return for immediate involvement in the war, and no way was he ever going to succumb to that particular offer.
Although De Valera had rejected this offer from Churchill, hostilities between the two men were not yet at an end. And before the war was over, the British and Irish people were to witness some of the most bitter and personal attacks ever exchanged between their leaders. Since the start of the Second World War, the Taoiseach Eamon De Valera and his British counterpart Winston Churchill had clashed repeatedly over Ireland's refusal to join the fight against Nazi Germany. Churchill's frustration with De Valera was further intensified in July 1940, as Britain came under attack. In what became known as the Battle of Britain, Hitler's Luftwaffe carried out the biggest bombing campaign the world had ever seen, devastating London and several other British cities, and killing over 43,000 civilians. As he surveyed the damage, Churchill prepared a bitter and stinging attack on De Valera.
Churchill used pretty much every occasion he got to slag off the Irish for not handing over the Atlantic seaports. The most public attack came in November 1940, when he used his parliamentary review of the war to blame Ireland for the extent of the losses. He said, if we had use of those ports, our losses would be far less.
Churchill makes a speech in the House of Commons making a call for the ports to be returned. And when you think of the way that the war is spread, that the many theatres of war, this is a little bit ludicrous that the British Prime Minister sees the solution to the Second World War in the return of 3 rocky inlets, if you like, along the coast of Ireland.
The Irish got terribly upset about this because it was seen as an attack on Irish neutrality, which in part it was, but they didn't see the context. The liner The Empress of Britain had been torpedoed just before this, with a huge loss of life. And there was significant agitation in Britain, in the media and elsewhere about this matter. And what Churchill was doing in the House of Commons was not really attacking Ireland. What he was doing in the House of Commons was dealing with a political problem that he had to face, with people criticising the government, with people being outraged about Ireland. And in many ways, I think we can interpret Churchill's intervention in November as actually diffusing the issue.
As the war continued to rage, so too did the diplomatic battle between De Valera and Churchill. And it intensified dramatically at the end of May 1941, when Churchill threatened to introduce conscription in Northern Ireland.
De Valera objected very strongly to conscription because A, it was something that reinforced partition, and B, because he felt that it was absolutely illegitimate to take Irish Catholics and force them to fight for what James Joyce had called the brutish empire.
The possibility of De Valera going to see Churchill in London as a reaction to the conscription crisis was seriously discussed. What De Valera decided to do instead of going to visit Churchill in London was to write him a letter. And the letter started off quite tame and quite positive and quite friendly, but he quickly moved on to the threat of conscription, the idea that it would revolt the human conscience. He's using very, very strong language. And this was the sort of rhetoric that Churchill would have associated with the De Valera of the Civil War era, the De Valera who had rejected the treaty, the disloyal De Valera, because that was often Churchill's frame of reference. And here was De Valera effectively inviting Churchill to think like that again.
Throughout the conscription crisis, the Irish High Commissioner in London, John Dulante, acted as a go-between for De Valera and Churchill. In doing so, he was to gain first-hand experience of the British Prime Minister's growing frustration.
Dulante has 2 major meetings with Churchill. In the first of these, Churchill is really annoyed with him and basically declaims the Dulante's report as of him being agitated, marching up and down the room, denouncing the Irish.
Churchill was obviously politically and personally enraged at De Valera. Delaunay spoke about how emotional Churchill had become. He pointed out in his dispatch, his report of the meeting, that he knew from his sources in decision-taking in London that a lot of people were worried about Churchill's emotionalism, whether that's tired and emotional and meant that Churchill was at the brandy, or that he just was under the colossal strain he was under. And he did give way to human frailty at times, and certainly one of the permanent thorns in his side that got that frailty going was Ireland, and bracketed with Ireland was De Valera.
By late 1941, Churchill decided that introducing conscription in the north would be more trouble than it was worth, and to De Valera's relief dropped the plan. But on the 7th of December, events on the other side of the world were to dramatically alter the course of the war, and with it, the fraught relationship between De Valera and Churchill.
The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor electrified American opinion in a way that I don't think anybody could really appreciate until perhaps 9/11. There was a spontaneous outburst of patriotism, feelings of national unity, of national pride, and especially of, I wouldn't call it revenge, but certainly a desire to rectify this situation, to get back at whoever did this, whoever was responsible for this sneak attack. Churchill was overjoyed by Pearl Harbor for obvious reasons. With the attack on Pearl Harbor, Churchill knew instantly that the United States was in the war and would be in the war to win. He said at the time that the United States was now in the war up to its neck.
He was very euphoric, really, because he knew that America coming in on our side ultimately meant that Britain was bound to win against Hitler, who was going to be squeezed between the Russian bear and the American buffalo.
Elated by America's entry into the war, Churchill turned his thoughts to Ireland once again. As midnight approached on the 7th of December, just 5 hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, he drafted an extraordinary and top-secret telegram to be sent to De Valera.
Well, Churchill was clearly euphoric. We can visualize him after a good dinner with a glass of brandy and a cigar and calling for his amanuenses and saying, now we'll send a telegram to Mr. De Valera.
He called in Mrs. Hill. He dictated this to her. Now is your chance, now or never, a nation once again, which was in quotation marks. It was a quotation he and De Valera both knew. And then, I'm very ready to meet you at any time. I'm very ready to meet you at any time. And he would have done it. I'm sure 2 days later he'd have been in Dublin if there was any chance at all of De Valera agreeing to enter the war.
At 2 a.m., De Valera was woken at home and told that the British representative in Ireland, Sir John Maffei, was on his way to deliver an urgent telegram from Churchill. Disturbed by what it might contain, De Valera put his military chiefs on standby.
De Valera was fearful that it could be an ultimatum, because you were just as likely to get a telegram from Churchill telling you you're about to be invaded as you were getting an offer of Irish unity. They were the kind of wild Churchillian gestures that came with drinking very good alcohol late into the night.
Churchill had not bothered to hide from De Valera his resentment about the treaty ports, and De Valera had always been frightened of what Churchill might do. And certainly in 1941, Churchill was on the up and up with the Americans coming into the war. And I think De Valera may well have felt that Churchill would use this opportunity to cut the Gordian knot and say, right, well, we're not worrying about coercion anymore, we're just going to do it.
But when he read the telegram from Churchill, De Valera realized there was no threat of an imminent British invasion, and he was suspicious of Churchill's apparent offer to end the partition of Ireland.
The fundamental question for De Valera was, could this be trusted? And if it is to be trusted, how is Churchill going to deliver on it? And is Winston Churchill going to be in a position to deliver the Unionists of Northern Ireland? So he was right to be sceptical.
Convinced that the telegram offered nothing substantial or different from the proposal put forward by Malcolm MacDonald 18 months earlier, De Valera prepared his response to Churchill.
De Valera took several days to reply to it, and turned down the implicit offer of an ending to partition. It was the cold, calculated De Valera policy. We don't abandon neutrality on the basis of bread today and jam tomorrow.
But the precise meaning of the telegram, and whether Churchill genuinely offered the prospect of Irish unity, remains a matter of debate.
There's a good question as to what actually he meant by this. I think what Dev thought he meant was that to be a nation once again was really, I will help you to get a united Ireland. What Churchill quite clearly was meaning was that Ireland will find her own soul if she comes in and joins in this great crusade against the tyrant, the evil one. And so he was making a sort of generalized appeal. Dev interpreted it as a repeat offer of uniting Ireland, and he rejected it as such.
I think this was a simple situation. A man who got quite excited, gets the rush of blood to his head, send out this cryptic message, but really didn't have a long-term strategy. On the other hand, I think it's fair to say that De Valera reacted in the longer term, looked at it and said, there's nothing here. It's just somebody making a pitch, and took it the calm way, and all the time wanted to see the colour of the promise before he was going to jump.
With America in the war and President Roosevelt already sending his troops to Europe, by the beginning of 1942, De Valera's determination to remain neutral was coming at a price. Now Ireland was increasingly isolated on the world stage, and neutrality was becoming a badge of dishonor.
De Valera was put in an incredibly difficult position by Pearl Harbor because it threw the vast majority of Americans behind the war effort instantaneously. Neutrality was now a bit of a dirty word in the United States. De Valera and Ireland at this point automatically, instantly became more isolated in the world.
The hour of victory is postponed, yet Mr. De Valera will not budge. Even the landing of the Americans in Ulster offends him.
When the American Expeditionary Force arrived in the north in January 1942, this was quite a crisis. Now the American forces were based on Irish soil. De Valera gave a speech the day after they arrived in which he said, it's not that we're against you, but we want to make clear once more that we claim that territory.
With America's entry into the war and significant strategic developments within Northern Ireland, the South's value to Britain's wartime interests was beginning to diminish.
It's clear from the British Cabinet agenda that Ireland is no longer of any strategic importance. Southern Ireland, that is. The reason being is because of Northern Ireland, and the ports are no longer of any significance because of the one big port that's been constructed on the banks of the Foyle at Derry, and that American and British destroyers are operating out of this out into the northwestern approaches. Aircraft are flying from Limavady and Eglinton and out into the Atlantic. They don't need airfields or bases or ports of any kind in the south. So De Valera can go and sit in the south to his heart's content. The war, or Ireland in the war effort, is no longer of importance.
Ireland's strategic importance really was gone. The the North could do everything that the South could have done earlier in the war. And I think there's a kind of a sense that the real story was happening elsewhere, but also a sense of just being left out, I think.
De Valera's Ireland became increasingly isolated as the Allied war effort began to gather pace, climaxing in the D-Day landings of June 1944.
The hour of our greatest effort and action is approaching. We march with valiant allies who count on us as we count on them. The flashing eyes of all our soldiers, sailors and airmen must be fixed upon the enemy on their front.
The bloody but successful D-Day landings of June 1944 marked a decisive turning point in the war. Now Churchill and his allies had the upper hand, and by August had already liberated Paris. Over the next 8 months, they continued to push Hitler's army back across Europe. Finally, with Germany on its knees and the Soviet Red Army already in Berlin, in April 1945, Hitler committed suicide. But the inevitable Allied victory did not ease relations between Churchill and De Valera. Just 2 days after Hitler's death, a dramatic development in Dublin was to provoke yet another crisis between the two men.
In May 1945, the war was coming to an end. It ended on May the 7th. The concentration camps were being liberated from mid-April on. The full extent of Nazi horror had become known to the world. And then off goes De Valera with all his authority as the head of this great republic to the German legation.
De Valera came in for a lot of criticism for deciding to visit the German ambassador to express his condolences on the death of Hitler. It was something that caused fury and outrage in the United States in particular. But it's also something that was criticised at home and subsequently has been criticised by many historians as well as being an appalling gaffe.
Nobody could understand why he had done this within his own government, his own party. But I think De Valera described it as proper diplomacy.
A lot had emerged already about the horrors of the Third Reich, and enough had come out to indicate that this was one of the most appalling regimes in history, if not the most appalling. And for De Valera to go along and do that thing, even though he knew all this, I think was an indication of the seriousness with which he took the business of being a neutral, right up to the last sort of mathematical dot.
As De Valera came under sustained criticism for his visit to the German legation, Churchill was basking in the glory of victory. But even now, in his finest hour, his thoughts turned once again to De Valera and his refusal to join the fight against Hitler.
One of the most interesting aspects of Churchill's attitude to Southern Ireland and to De Valera came in his great triumphant victory speech on the 13th of May.
This national government was sustained by Parliament and by the entire British nation at home.
Churchill is euphoric at this point. Everything has gone Churchill's way. He's, he wants his moment. And as part of his moment, he lays into Ireland yet again.
Owing to the action of Mr. De Valera, so much at variance with the temper and instinct of thousands of southern Irishmen, the approaches which the southern Irish ports and airfields could so easily have guarded were closed by the hostile aircraft and U-boats.
It was a very nasty speech as far as Ireland was concerned, as far as De Valera personally was concerned. He allowed himself to become more personal than he'd ever allowed himself to become in public. Some of the private venom overflowed into the public arena.
this was indeed a deadly moment in our life. And if it had not been for the loyalty and friendship of Northern Ireland, we should have been forced to come to close quarters with Mr. De Valera or perish forever from the earth.
It's rather a cheap shot at De Valera, really. And I think after the war, he probably should have had bigger things on his mind and better things on his mind than a quick swipe at De Valera and a quick rap of De Valera's knuckles for not getting involved. It really wasn't necessary.
And we left the De Valera government to frolic with the German and later with the Japanese representatives to their heart's content.
You can still see Winston Churchill in that address in 1945 using a frame of reference that's nearly 20 or 30 years old with regard to the treacherous Irish once again and what they have been doing and who they have been frolicking with and the restraint and poise that was shown by Great Britain in not invading Ireland. And this is, of course, an attack that would have really jarred with the Irish public at large as well as with Irish politicians, because restraint and poise were not words that they associated with the British approach to Ireland if you look back at the long history of the relationship between the two countries.
After Churchill's stinging attack on their country and Taoiseach, the Irish people eagerly awaited De Valera's response. And when it came, in a radio broadcast 3 days later, they were not disappointed.
But the mood in the country was that there had to be a reply, that Churchill couldn't be allowed to get away with this. And it's built up by the Irish press, that the whole Fianna Fáil propaganda machine is there, the government propaganda machine is working on the speech, and it becomes, I suppose, a national classic.
Mr. Churchill makes it clear that in certain circumstances he would have violated our neutrality and that he would justify his action by Britain's necessity. Surely Mr. Churchill must see a like justification can be framed for similar acts of aggression elsewhere, and no small nation adjoining a great power could ever hope to be permitted to go its own way in peace.
He put Churchill completely in the wrong, in a very measured, dignified, cool, thoughtful way. So that where Churchill was going over the top, De Valera responded absolutely. I mean, it was a brilliant forensic exercise.
Mr. Churchill is proud of Britain's stand alone after France had fallen and before America entered the war. Could he not find it in his heart the generosity to acknowledge that there is a small nation that stood alone, not for 1 year or two, but for several hundred years?
That is designed for an Irish audience, and they loved it. It was a tremendously popular speech. It was printed in the Irish press. There were cartoons in Dublin Opinion of Churchill listening to the radio with the caption, "Listen and learn." Of course, the idea that Churchill was going to learn anything from this, except that De Valera was just as bad as he thought, was, madness.
Churchill knew he had been beaten. That's why he called it De Valera's finest hour.
Although De Valera had won a memorable victory over Churchill on this occasion, now that the war was over, it was becoming increasingly clear that there was a price to be paid for his decision to keep Ireland neutral.
The problem with De Valera's stance on neutrality was that it reinforced partition and thus made the prospect of a united Ireland that much more impossible. I mean, just pushed it out of the window, really.
Not only did De Valera see his cherished dream of an end to partition become more distant, his policy of neutrality was about to have a dramatic impact on Ireland's position in post-war Europe.
I don't believe that he would have or could have regretted his policy of neutrality. In many ways, in terms of internal Irish politics, it copper-fastened the state. But in terms of outside of Ireland, the sense of being left out was palpable. It was very difficult for De Valera in particular to have to face his own irrelevance to the post-war world.
After trading blows across the Irish Sea for over 30 years, finally De Valera and Churchill came face to face in September 1953. And when they sat down to lunch at 10 Downing Street, the two men found that they had many stories to share.
Apparently the two men talked about their soldiering experience. Churchill was talking about his various military involvements, his various soldiering, and he asked De Valera, had you done a bit of soldiering yourself? A reference comes to 1916. It was appropriate that the two would finally meet. And remember, they were both still in power at that stage as well. I mean, they did share that political longevity. They had natural leadership abilities, and they both were fighting elections a lot of the time. De Valera probably won more than Winston Churchill did at that stage. So they did have a lot in common.
I think that they both earned the immense gratitude of their fellow citizens by, in some sense, both being completely impossible. De Valera was impossible in the sense that he went on and on and on, trying. He got the Republic, but he didn't get the United Ireland. Churchill went on and on and on, resisting Hitler, resisting appeasement. So I think by courage, both men had that quality which Churchill said was the most important quality of them all because it guaranteed all the rest. They both had courage, and they both became icons of their respective compatriots.